welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ashlea Halpern. I'm a contributing editor at Condé Nast Traveler. Also work a lot for Afar and Time Magazine and Oprah and all kinds of places, mostly in the US, titles and publications. Been specializing in travel for, I don't even know, 20 years at this point. And my travel life has recently changed though, because I have a 2-year-old at home and 2-year-olds change everything. So it's been a bit of a learning curve, learning to bring him abroad, but I'm so happy to be discussing this topic because things I thought would be impossible, like taking a child on safari, actually not impossible. So that's what we're here to talk about today is family safaris and hopefully encourage more parents to get out there and take their kids into the bush. So I'm joined here by Maija. Maija, can you pronounce your last name for me before I butcher it and embarrass myself?
It's Maija and Ashlea. It's complicated.
There we go. So she's the managing director at Go to Africa, which is an award-winning safari and B Corp certified safari operator based in Cape Town, South Africa. And she's been 25 years in the business. She's featured in this month's issue of Travel and Leisure as their newest A-list advisor. But what I really loved, especially about her, she has all these expertise in Southern and Eastern Africa because she's also taken her kids on a bunch of safaris in this area and planned hundreds more for Go to Africa. In November, I worked with Maija and Ashlea Duran, who's another safari expert from Go to Africa, to plan a trip. It was part of a 23-day, 3-country solo trip I did with my son, just he and I, and 9 of those days were in Tanzania, in Zanzibar. And I wound up writing about it for Condé Nast Traveler, among some other places. So today we're going to talk about the realities of taking kids of all different ages on safaris, get some tips from Maija, spotlight some of the best lodges and parks, kind of based on your kids' ages and what they're ready for or interested in, and then answer some of the questions, some that you've submitted beforehand, and feel free to drop into the chat. So welcome, Maija, and congratulations on your Travel and Leisure Award.
Thank you so much, Ashlea, and thank you to all our guests who have joined today. I'm really passionate about this topic, so I'm hoping that I can share some tips and tricks and also a little bit of my experience of taking my kids on safari. And I honestly took my daughter from, she was a couple of weeks old, strapped on, got on the safari vehicle, and that was her. So it has been for me one of the most rewarding and actually memorable experiences, to the extent that my children tell me probably once a month, "Mommy, you're never allowed to quit your job because we want to keep on going on safari." So just some quick background. At Go to Africa, we specialize in many types of safaris, and we, of course, get requests from all around the world, people with different budgets, different desires, different needs. And we obviously also get quite a few requests from actually grandparents that are planning multi-generational trips, and as well as parents who want to understand a little bit more about taking kids on safari. And what I can say is that we often hear the hesitation in their voice. It's nearly like they come with this preconceived idea of you can't really take your child on safari. I think what most people assume is you're sitting for hours on a vehicle. How's that going to look for a toddler? Or how's that going to look for a baby? Or how's it even going to look for my 6-year-old? And then, we get an opportunity to walk them through those realities of what it can look like and dispel some of the myths I think that people have, which I totally understand, by the way, that one would have them. And we really managed to turn that kind of hesitation into excitement. And I can tell you the other thing that is wonderful is that pre-excitement you get from planning a safari with your family, including the children, and actually making them part of that process is also so incredibly special because you have something to look forward to work towards as a family, and then actually go and experience it.
Definitely. But just real quick, Maija, someone had asked in the chats how old your children are.
Great. Good question. Thank you. My daughter she's just turned 7. My son just turned 11. I will speak a little bit more about having taken them on safari, but they've both been on safari since a very young age. My son was on his first safari at 7 months. We did a road trip through Namibia. And my daughter had the privilege of going earlier than that because she was the second child. And I realized that I could be actually very pragmatic with having, one of those mandukas or baby Bjorn. We'll talk about that a bit later, how we managed.
So yeah, obviously when I came into this, I had my own concerns and fears, and I'd been on 4 safaris so far. So this was my 5th safari in Africa. And, there were definitely some countries that originally you were like, well, Kenya and South Africa have a lot more structure. But of course I was like, no, let's make this difficult. I want to go somewhere I haven't been before. And and we agreed on Tanzania, and you just recommended like the most perfect places. I love them so much, the ones we wound up staying in. We discussed everything from, am I comfortable with an unfenced camp? Am I comfortable with traveling in malaria zones? And so I'm curious, like, what are some of the most common questions you get, and how do you typically field them when people first come to you talking about children and safaris?
I think one of the most common one is, what age is best for my children to go on safari? And I think that entirely depends on the parents and the family, and also your spirit of how you travel. Every family is different. My take is you can take them from a young age, because the camps that actually do take children from all ages are fully adapted towards that. So as an example, if you're taking a baby, you would, for instance, only go on your game drive for an hour, let's say 1 in the morning, 1 in the evening, and then bumble slowly back to camp. Ideally have your own vehicle so that you're more flexible. And so you also don't feel pressurized. Like, if your baby starts crying, for instance, that stress that one gets as a parent, if there's other people around, especially on safari, let's say you're looking at a lion, eating a kill, and then your baby starts screaming, that'll stress you out and the other guests. So the private vehicle is definitely the way to go. And you can really see like how your child does, really small. If you're popping them in their carrier or they're laying next to you in a car seat, I mean, you can go for hours sometimes, depending on their sleep patterns or exactly where they are during the day. Similarly, taking toddlers and anything between like the age of 4 and upwards, it is so exciting for them. And I think we underestimate how the bush and the nature and the animals can really intrigue the kids. And I can tell you, the one thing that makes me sad is when I go on safari and there's some children that are constantly on their devices. And I think it's such an opportunity to actually take a device away from your child, and there might be a bit of rebellion around that, and actually immerse them into that experience, because I promise you they get into it 100%. Can they go on drives? Can they do the activities? Absolutely. Best is to have the private vehicle. Can they do the activities? The activities are so wide ranging. I mean, you can do everything from, and this is camp dependent, but let me give you an example of the various activities. You can go do nature walks. From a certain age, you can actually go walking with a guide in the bush. You can walk with giraffes. You can meet the Maasai or the equivalent tribal communities that are around you. You can learn spear throwing. You can decorate safari-themed biscuits. You can identify tracks and dung and understand how the whole ecosystem works. There's mini ranger courses, cooking interactions, feeding at certain animals. So there really is a mass array of activities, and we would really tailor and recommend the camp that would suit kind of your child's interests or your interests as well. And then just maybe one other question that we get, what kind of age restrictions exist? I mean, this is really where you need to understand what camps allow kids, which camps don't. Some allow kids from 6, some allow from 5, some only allow from 12, some allow all ages. So you really got to understand that, because that really plays into also what kind of safari you're going to end up having.
And on that note in particular, there's a difference between camps that accept kids and camps that welcome kids. And I really appreciate, and I was very, as you know, like very nervous about that. I don't want to be tolerated. I want to feel welcome. And the camps that you recommended, Gibbs Farm and Tassa Lodge, I cannot speak highly enough about both of them. From the minute we arrived, the staff would they were way better parents than I am. Like they just swept in and made my son feel like a king. It was an incredible experience, and that really matters. And I think having an expert like you, who's been to these places, who's vetted them, who knows the tolerance levels of camps, who knows which camps are going to be better for an 11-year-old rather than a 2-year-old, so vital.
It's a really good point. And I think that's the whole that's also what you want to achieve as parents and a family on holiday, right? You want a win-win situation where the child's having a great time and you as a parent are feeling unstressed and you're loving the fact that your child is well taken care of and is learning all these new things. And that automatically puts you as a parent on a like more holiday, spirit, I want to say, because your child's happy, you're happy. And so I think that's a really good point, is to just match that up correctly. And maybe to the point, like teenage children, you wouldn't necessarily take to a lodge that has a cool kids club because they're not interested in that. But you would maybe want to take them to a place where they can start doing gorilla trekking, for instance, from 15 onwards. It's a mind-blowing experience. It's on many people's bucket lists, but that's just, I think, the difference where you want to make sure that you're picking the right region, the right lodge for your child's age.
Right. And so do people ask you about buyouts versus lodges?
So buyouts, you mean that you take out the whole camp?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And they definitely do. And especially with multi-gen or just larger families where maybe the aunts and uncles are bolting on, or cousins, or multi-gen is always a good example. I recommend it. And remember, a lot of the lodges only have 6 or 7 rooms, right? So it actually isn't that difficult to do a buyout. You book 7 cottages or 7 rooms in the camp, and you've got the whole camp to yourself. And it's such a privilege because then you can start adapting some of the kind of safari routine to exactly what you want as a family. So you're not bound to the routine of some camps. Some camps have a routine of when they go out and when they come back and when they have tea and when you. So, and then you suddenly, it's like it's your own place. And I've had a privilege of doing that multi-gen actually with my parents and my husband's parents and our children, and my sister and her husband. And we managed to have a whole camp to ourselves because of that. And it really does add another level of kind of speciality to the trip because it's so intimate, and you have the whole place to yourself.
And let's talk about flying with kids, because that was another, concern. We sort of talked about these small, like light aircraft, bush planes. Personally, my son loved them. It was very exciting, I think, to him. And also there was one epic meltdown. He was teething. He had an epic meltdown in the Serengeti, like waiting for a bush flight. And the only thing that finally calmed him was the sound of like the motor, the propellers, I guess, on the plane. So I was just like, when I finally got him and we were like taking off. So what are some of the like questions you get around flying with kids?
So, the first question is, can I have my child in a small confined space, a 10-seater plane? I think that's a big one. Parents are concerned. And, you also obviously got to evaluate how long the flight is. A flight can be anything from a 20-minute lodge hop to, 3 hours, depending how far you're going. I recently was on a small bush plane in Tanzania, actually with my own kids. This was a few months back. And we flew to an island called Rubondo, which is in Lake Victoria, and then went on to the Serengeti. And there was a family that had a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old on the plane with us. And it was, for them, it was absolutely fine. Again, the kids are fascinated by the plane and the pilot, and you don't have the door separating you from the pilot, so they can sit next to the pilot and see all the gadgets and the big headphones and the noise. And so I think the one concern you might have as a parent, can my child's stomach flying like that? Do they get airsick? I think you'd probably evaluate that similar on like, do they get car sick? And again, it's not necessarily a reason not to do it. You could, give them certain medications to help with that.
And another one that I got this question, I wasn't as concerned. Maybe I should have been, but I would get this question a lot. They'd be like, how can you have a toddler? Won't they scare off the wildlife, or won't they be a danger? Aren't lions and elephants going to come charging when they hear a high pitched squeal from a toddler? So what's your response to those kinds of questions?
Yeah. And I think it's such a valid one. So what's really interesting on safari, and it still blows my mind to this day, is that the animals see the safari vehicle as like this unit in the nature. So they don't even actually per se recognize that there's human beings sitting on it. They see the vehicle with the people on it as a thing. Right. So that's the first thing, is that's why you'll find when you're on safari that you can often drive right up to a lion kill and the lions are just like, oh, there's just this thing again that's there. They in some way they also get used to it in an area where there's frequent safari vehicles traveling around. So even if a child would sit on a vehicle like that and make a high-pitched noise, animals generally don't get too bothered about it. So And then again, best to have your own vehicle so you don't get stressed. And the game rangers are very experienced, and they'll also help navigate through anything like that. And if it really were to come to a point, let's say your toddler is having what do you say, a little frothy, the guide would probably, after some minutes, gracefully turn around with the vehicle and just move away. The one thing is obviously the question around what happens in camps that are unfenced, and quite, not all camps are fenced. In fact, these days, a lot of camps are unfenced because that's part of the charm of having animals come into camp. At night, you're not allowed to walk around camp on your own. So that's the first thing. They will always guide you with a spotlight and a guide that will help you from your room back to the main lodge and back. Because obviously at night the predators are coming out, and that's just more dangerous. During the day, it's fine to walk around, but you would never let your child walk on their own. You would always make sure the child is obviously with you. I mean, that's just a safety precaution. But again, all in all, it's not really an issue at all, although it might seem so. And I think especially if you've never seen what a camp like that looks like, it can actually be very daunting trying to imagine camp, here's an elephant, there's this wildlife, there's no fence, here's my child. Like, what does that mean? But again, the animals are quite accustomed to humans in camp. And as said, at night, you certainly don't walk around on your own.
Yeah, and that was exactly our experience at night. We were always accompanied by a guard with a light, and during the day, I think it's funny. We had several people take pictures of us, like we were the attraction because I had a toddler on safari. But having the private vehicle, I think for us was essential, because we could really like go with the mood of my son, and we could pull away if we were sensing that he was going to have some kind of meltdown that could disturb the animals or anything like that. And the guides are just so good at reading the animal behavior and reading like children behavior too. Like our guides, especially Martin, who was that Gibbs Farm, was just fantastic. Like my son loved him so much. There'd be like a lion right there out the window, but my son was just like fixated on the guide. He's like in love with the guide. So the people are everything.
Yeah.
And absolutely. So can you talk a little about kind of self-drive safaris versus shared drive versus private drive?
So, I mean, the self-drive would be generally through a national park. So if we're talking a national park, the Kruger National Park is the park that is funded and held by the government, whereas you also have private camps within the Kruger Park, which are privately owned. And run by private lodges. So, and the same in the Mara, you have the Masai Mara National Park, which anyone can access. It's the national park held by the government, but you also have private camps in the Mara, for instance, the Naibosho Conservancy, where there's a private camp and there's private vehicles. So you can self-drive in national parks. Whether I recommend it, if the budget allows, I wouldn't recommend it, just because you're basically one of many not really knowing where the wildlife is, right? You just basically either following other cars or seeing where there's a bunch of cars, you kind of assume there's an animal there. And then you are really vying for position, because the national parks often don't have a restriction on how many cars can be at one sighting. So it's you and 25 other cars trying to see the poor leopard, trying to walk through the cars. It becomes a bit of a challenge. So what we generally always recommend is go with a guide. If you are in a national park, go with a guide, because they know where to look for the game, they know the drill, they know the roads. You're just bound to have a better experience based on the experience and expertise that they have. If you're already staying in a private conservancy, you will be in a game vehicle with a guide. You're not allowed to drive on your own there. So there you will have a great experience. And then the shared vehicles is often, if let's say you're only two people and there's lots of rooms of two people, they tend to bunch those rooms together. So you'll sit with other guests on a vehicle. I mean, it depends entirely on you. It can be a fantastic socializing experience, meeting people from all over the world. Generally, people on safari can be quite like-minded. So I've always had a great experience when I've shared a vehicle, because I find because of the setting you're in and because a lot of hours can go by, you tend to have great conversations with people you wouldn't just normally have around a dinner table. And then, of course, if you just want to be on your own, or you have your family and you actually don't want other people to be part of that, then you would most certainly ask for a private vehicle. And then you tend to pay a supplement fee, depending on the lodge. And then you just get your own vehicle with your people.
I'm sure it's child dependent, personality dependent, but in your experience, at what age can kids start to join a shared vehicle?
Look, my own children have been going on a shared vehicle since the age of 3 because they've been doing safari so long. They understand what it's about. So they understand when you get on this car that's open and we see lions, this is the drill, right? So I obviously have the privilege being in Africa and, at the kind of gateway to many safaris, that my children are primed towards that. I would say, to be on the safe side, you'd want to have a child that can understand instructions and is already old and mature enough to understand what it means. And again, that can vary. Some kids at 4, some at 7, I think 6 is probably 5, 6 is starting to be on the safer side of taking children on a shared vehicle. But again, it depends on the child. Like if you have a child that's still having, frothies at that age and you can't control it, then you might want to think twice about it, because again, the most stressed person on the vehicle is going to be you as the parent. So
yeah, it's like flying with them. Let's talk a little about the different types of safaris people can do. Big 5, great apes. Can you give us kind of highlights?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. So Big 5 is obviously the most common that people ask for. There's certainly different types of, I want to say, ape safaris. Gorilla trekking is a big theme as well. Rwanda and Uganda, especially the Congo as well. And that's specifically usually to see gorillas, but they're usually subspecies that you can see on those trips too. Then, for instance, I mean, there's one particular island in Lake Victoria that I mentioned earlier on where you can see chimpanzees, and there are several other areas. So if chimps really, are of interest to you, and the story actually behind, for instance, how the chimps got there, then that's something you would do. That same island doesn't have Big 5, but it has elephants and it has an array of beautiful birds, for instance. So you go there for the birds and the chimps and the elephants. Some people do birding safaris only. They're not even interested in the Big 5. Some people do what we call the small 5, and they want to just see these small animals that are categorized under the small 5. You also get the ugly 5. So some people are very interested in the ugly 5, which includes things like the marabou stork and vultures and wildebeest, hyenas, which aren't the most attractive animals, but you can take great photos. And then the other thing is going on safari for the landscape. So the animals are there, but there's certain landscapes that are absolutely worth seeing. And the one place I can think of is southern Tanzania. The landscapes there are just so different to the Serengeti. Plus, it's totally uncrowded. So I always say to guests, don't go to the Serengeti, don't go to Masai Mara. It's full of people. Actually go to the places that are really still quite untouched, and you get these beautiful landscapes that you wouldn't get in the big areas. Plus, you get the game.
And what about, so parents who, maybe not my son's age, but a little older, they're interested in social impact, conservation, geography. What are sort of the educational components for a safari that parents might want to know about for their kids?
So I think there's a lot around the positive impact space. I mean, most lodges these days are involved in wildlife, community, environmental kind of impact projects. Anti-poaching is a big one. So for instance, I mean, I'll give an example of a camp that's actually up in Laikipia in Kenya that actually covers a lot of these areas. They have an anti-poaching unit that you can visit. They have 2 of the last northern white rhinos, which is fascinating for kids and adults alike, and understanding that story and how they're trying to recreate it. So there's a bit of a wildlife story. There's horseback riding you can do in quite a few camps, which allows you to see the landscape from a totally different perspective, and you learn a lot about the plants and the smaller animals and the birds. So if that interests children, community is a big thing. I mean, children can go out and play, let's say, a football game with the community children, or go see what the community does on a day-to-day basis and understand their culture. So that's a big aspect, culture and community. There's a lot of interest around craftsmanship and what the various communities in the different regions and countries actually do. And it's so different from place to place. And, of course, there's things like learning how to guide and learning how to track animals. So you really can find something for everyone of interest. I mean, if you are interested in geology, you'll be able to do a safari that will explain the geology of the area and, how the mountains formed.
I'm based in the US, so getting to Africa, it's a long haul. It's partly why I had broken up the trip in the United Arab Emirates and then Oman on the way back. But what are some extensions people can add? They're coming this far. Are there like city components, or in our case, we went to Zanzibar after being in the bush to have some beach time? What are the extensions people can do on these trips?
What we often recommend is firstly cities. So let's talk about some of the biggest cities in Africa. I mean, I think Cape Town's obviously iconic. So if people are coming on safari to South Africa, we can't say don't come to Cape Town. There's just too much to see. There's too much art. There's too much culture. There's the winelands if you enjoy your wine. There's an amazing food scene if you enjoy your food. I mean, we have some of the top-rated restaurants in the world in Cape Town, so people are very interested in that. And then the same for other cities. Nairobi is similar to offer. Kigali is really interesting to see, and so on and so forth. And then the other big one, to your point of beach, a lot of people like to hang on beach. It's kind of this like relaxation in the sea and the sun component after safari, which is totally different, and it's more about downtime. And there's so many options. I mean, you can do anything from Seychelles to Mauritius to Reunion to Zanzibar. Kenya's coast is beautiful, and lots of different coastal areas you can go to with different components and characteristics. So certainly, I think the best safari, if you've got the budget, is first understand one of the African cities and do a little bit around that, then go on safari, then end off with a beach component.
Let's talk a little about some of the sort of boring practical stuff that has to happen, like vaccinations and visas, and what kinds of concerns do people bring to you about those, and how can Go to Africa help?
There's quite a few concerns, actually. I mean, vaccination is definitely one of them. What vaccinations do I need for the country that I'm going to? The other one is entry requirements. What do I need visas? I must tell you, the visa requirements can change quickly in Africa. So Kenya had a visa system a few months ago, then suddenly from one day to the next change it to a travel authorization, which if you didn't know about this, you would rock up at the airport and not have the right papers and then be denied entry. And I saw it happening myself 2 weeks ago in Kenya. I actually saw people being denied all because they just didn't know. They didn't know about it. So obviously it helps to have a partner tour operator who can give you the latest updates when these requirements change. The other ones are malaria. People want to know about malaria and whether they should or should not take the tablets. The other ones are around, for instance, South Africa has some real requirements about birth certificates you need to bring for your children. Again, you need to know about these quirky requirements because you will get denied entry if you don't, which is the most disappointing thing can happen if you're coming from the US on a long haul flight. You land in a country and you don't have the right documents on you. And it's documents that you, as Americans, would never assume are never going to be needed anywhere, right? And then this country has quirky requirements. So you got to know about those. And then where do I take my children? Is it safe? Is it not safe? The age thing comes up a lot. Like, my child is this age. Can it actually go on safari? What about food? My child doesn't eat this. Fussy eater. What does that mean? Can you make a plan? The answer is mainly yes, we can absolutely make a plan, depending also on the lodge, but most of the time. So those are some of the kind of key things that come up. And then obviously, what do I wear? What do I bring along? What do I need in my suitcase to be practically equipped for going on a good safari?
Right. And I think that was probably one of my biggest concerns. And because I was doing this 3-country trip and I needed a stroller in the other parts of the trip, but I didn't need one. And in the bush flight, and you were so helpful in just figuring out what I couldn't bring on a bush plane and making those arrangements. And the vaccination thing was, I had to get certain vaccinations for my son before we came. And we did do the malaria pills, which, let me tell you, trying to get a toddler, and I'm crushing it up and hiding it in cheese, to give to the dog, all the different ways I could try to get him to take this tiny sliver of a malaria pill each day. So I think you have to have a little bit of an adventurous spirit, and be down for the challenge. But it was definitely, in hindsight, absolutely one of the best things I've done with him, and it has made me as a parent feel so much more empowered to do. We're going to India next. I'm gonna do a round the world trip with him. It makes you feel like you can do anything with them when you can do something like that. One other question. What about for LGBTQ families? What should they know if they're considering a safari?
Very unfortunately, there are still some African countries where that's an issue, which obviously we find incredibly difficult to understand. We would want to at least make them aware so they're not maybe surprised in any way. But I mean, there's really few and far between places where that's actually an issue. And as I hope most listeners know, for instance, South Africa is incredibly LGBT friendly, especially a city like Cape Town.
And let's talk a little about trips by age. Are there specific trips you would steer a family that has teens toward, or tweens, or that sort of sweet spot between like 5 and 10, where they're really like curious and interested in the world, but like not too cool to not be seen with their parents?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I just touched on it earlier on, like saying teenagers, you with teenagers, you probably want to really think about doing something with an activity if that's what your child is like. For instance, I mentioned the gorilla trekking. Consider something like that versus with the smaller kids, you would do something where they actually have like, wild child programs where the trackers are there and trained and taught and interested in kids to help them with tracking and doing the little insects and really doing the things that, let's say, 5 to 9-year-olds would enjoy. So you would choose more of a camp in that sphere. And then there's that funny age between like 10 to 13, 14, where again, you would choose your camp accordingly. And I would say you'd want to make sure that there's quite a lot of other activities that children can also tag onto, whether it's spear hunting or it's learning how to shoot a bow and arrow onto a tree, or whether it's walking with giraffes, they can kind of choose it and stay busy and active.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention there was, I think I was at Taza Lodge, and there was a family of 8, and they had 6 kids under 10, and they had 2-year-old twins, a 4-year-old, a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 10-year-old. And every single kid was just so excited. By the end of the day, I would see them at dinner, and one had done exactly like you said, the bow and arrow thing. And another was like practicing Swahili phrases with the staff. It was so incredible to see, even with a family that large and so many different ages, how they could cater to the different groups. And they were all just as excited about what they were doing.
Yeah, that's a good point. Absolutely.
There have been some questions dropped in chat, so if we could do some sort of rapid fire questions. Jane asked, where's the best place to see wild elephants?
There's so many, Jane. Wow. I mean, like I said, we can choose it across Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe. They all have big communities of elephants that you will most certainly see. So I think we take it a notch down and say, great, okay, you want to see elephants, and we'll make sure that there's a place where you can see lots of them and get close to them too. And then what are your next interests? Because then you can tailor make it below the elephant kind of mark if that's kind of your one requirement.
Let's see. Sherry asked that you mentioned children and technology. Is there Wi-Fi available on Safari, or are phones just used for their cameras?
Most lodges these days do have Wi-Fi. Not all of them will always have Wi-Fi in the rooms, but they will most certainly have it in the common areas. Some lodges have a view that you shouldn't have Wi-Fi in your room, so they basically restrict you. You actually can't use a device in a room, which I sometimes find frustrating, and at the same time I find quite liberating because you just don't have the choice. And so you tend to spend less time on your device if you have to sit in the common area with others, downloading emails or whatever it is. There are camps that don't have Wi-Fi, but we'll always tell you about that before. And they're often the camps that are more remote and actually potentially arguably not a place where you want to be on a device. But again, you need to tailor make that according to your needs, right? I know there are people that go in Safari that still have to be on work calls and need to, do emails, etc. Then we'll just make sure that there's a camp with good Wi-Fi in the places that you need it.
Kathy Tompkins asked, any weather issues in January? I would imagine that's location dependent.
Yeah, it's absolutely location dependent. So let me give one example, Kathy. January in Cape Town is the best time to be because we're in summer. It's beautiful at the beach. It's clear skies. It's 30 degrees. If you go on safari in January in South Africa, Kruger, it is incredibly hot. So if you don't like the heat that much, when I'm saying hot, it's 10 degrees higher than in Cape Town, at least. The best time to go on safari in South Africa is actually July, August, which coincides with the US holidays, actually, because it's dry season and you tend to see a lot more game because it's not raining. January's wet season, so it does rain in the Kruger, and it's very green and crisp, so you tend to not see as many animals, but at the same time it's a beautiful time to go because there's lots of babies out. So again, it depends what you want. And same for Kenya, Tanzania, you need to look at each location in terms of what's the best time.
And last question that was in the chat from Karen, how do we travel with CPAP machines?
Not a problem. We have a lot of clients traveling with them, and we can always accommodate it with extra hands and extra help to take it along.
Well, that is all the time we have. We really appreciate all the parents and kids who might have joined us today. And I hope that this inspires or empowers you to feel like this is something you can do. I wasn't so sure before I met Maija and worked with Go to Africa, but now I'm like sold, and I can't wait to just take my son on more and more of these adventures, and it'll only get better as he understands and gets more excited about what he's seeing and what he's doing.
Yeah, totally.
Thank you so much, Maija.
Yeah, it really becomes part of their awareness and their being. Hey, if you can take them once a year, we're lucky we get to do it at least twice a year, but it becomes really part of who they are, which is really rewarding to watch as a parent, just because of this being outside under the stars, under the in the nature with the animals. Thank you so much for moderating this. Really fun to talk about it, actually, because I'm so passionate about it. And then also thank you for all of our guests that actually joined us today. I really appreciate you being here. And yeah, we really, really hope to see you on safari. And again, we have many, many African safari experts that do the same. They take their children on safari. So a big team that can certainly assist with these requests. Thank you all.
All right.
For attending.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day and safe travels.